people started saying, don't teach Western Civ at all, because our poor little children will be tainted by it. Their minds will be tempted to admire something in our past. We have to always keep people focused on the future, right? We have to keep people focused on that utopian future that we're building through the proliferation of government programs and whatnot. But don't look back, right? Don't look back. Or if you look back in anger. It was at Berkeley that the whole anti-Western Civ movement got started in '88. But, it began with a gigantic lie. And the lie was that Western civilization was a fiction created in the 20th century by American educationalists who wanted to send boys off to war with their hearts beating for the West, right?
So it's both evil and a force of imperialism and destruction, such that we shouldn't even study it. And if you don't study it, then how do you even know? How do you even know if it's worse or not? Like, the whole thing just doesn't make sense to me. Like, how does it pass muster? Did everyone sane just go, like, where did all the adults go?
The fact is that we are Western. We have a Western system of government that's the fruit of very long tradition, going back to the Greeks and the Romans, but also includes the Middle Ages, medieval republics. People need to have some kind of sense of what our story is, not just as Americans, but as Americans, part of Western civilization. If they don't learn that, they're going to be, they won't understand the world they're living in. What's especially bad about this approach is you don't study why things succeeded and why things failed, because that's the whole point of historical study, or always has been from the time of Herodotus in the 5th century BC. History was written to instruct citizens and statesmen about what worked well in the past, what worked badly, what seemed to be a good idea at the time and turned out not to be a good idea at the time. So the whole process of teaching practical wisdom is the antidote for fanaticism, because people who know history are not going to be stampeded into some radical movement if they have some counterweight in their mind against it. My favorite example is COVID, right? Because COVID, when it broke out, people were running around like chickens with their head cut off.
Right.
They had no idea what was going to happen. Well, I don't have to rehearse that whole story. But eventually it turned out that 1% of the population died from COVID, which was terrible to have COVID deaths, slightly higher than other pneumatic diseases. But if you're a historian, you know that something like 40% of the population of the Mediterranean died of plague in the 6th century AD, and a similar number in the 14th century AD, so that there was no call to be stampeded the way we were, and our civil rights taken completely away from us by these dictatorial regimes that were put in the time of COVID. But I think if people had more historical sense, they would have been more resistant to this. We would have been asking more questions.
There's this phrase, right? Those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. How true is that phrase for you as a historian?
Well, not much, frankly. I think that people that human actions do fall into certain patterns. I think that people who are ignorant of history will make the same mistakes. But that's, one of the reasons why you study history, not to make the same mistakes. History does not have, I'm a believer in human free will, right? So I don't think that there's inevitable patterns that, and I think very few historians believe that there are kind of mechanical patterns of cyclical history that we're all going to go through all the time. Plato has this view in the Republic. There's a regular cycle of constitutional change, but it doesn't stand up to even Greek historical information. So I'm very critical of this idea that there's going to be a necessary pattern in history. I don't think that history is a scientific discipline. It's it's an art that makes use of sciences. So people who believe that are making a claim to knowledge that is impossible. Machiavelli, in a way, tries to do this. He has overconfidence in his own ability to predict the future. I once went through the works of Machiavelli looking for all the predictions that he made, and none of them came true, right? And he's talking. This will give you an example of Machiavelli's ability to predict the future. He's talking in The Prince, and he says that ecclesiastical principalities, because they are ruled by priests and people believe religion, they are completely stable and can never be undermined. He's thinking of the papacy. So he says this in around 1516. In 1517, the Reformation breaks out, right? And he doesn't appear to notice. I've read through I've read through a lot of the correspondence of Machiavelli. He doesn't seem to know that there's a Reformation going on in Germany, which is deposing hundreds of ecclesiastical princes all over Germany and the rest of Europe. So he's a terrible prophet. Anyway, so I don't really think that history repeats itself. Sometimes said history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. I think that's correct, that we find similar situations. And that, frankly, is why history is valuable, because there are similar situations. And there's also a sense that many more possibilities are out there than the average person is willing to entertain. So it's sometimes said that the only historical event that international relations theorists are aware of are 1938 and Munich, right?
Right.
I'm exaggerating somewhat, but you understand that 1938 and Churchill and Chamberlain and Hitler, that comes up constantly. And because it's a familiar episode, but there's so much more possibility out there in all of history. So when you learn more about what has happened in the past and all the different ways that things can turn out, you have much more practical wisdom, much more prudence, as the old term is. You have a sense of how many ways things can go wrong. So, the progressives are always saying, we know what's going to happen next. Here's our program. Just give us money and everyone will be happy. And conservatives are always saying, haven't we tried that? Didn't we try that in the 1960s? Don't we have programs that already do that on the books? But, so history, I really think that history and conservatism are very closely allied. And it's a kind of a mystery to me how so much of the history profession has gone so far to the left, despite the, I think, natural tendency of people with historical knowledge to be conservative. Now, I'm maybe self-refuting myself here, because there are so many historians that are on the left today. But that wasn't the case when I first got to Harvard. I have to say that we had a generation of people who had fought in the Second World War. They knew what they were fighting for. They were fighting for the West. They weren't just fighting for America. And so it's very hard for me to understand why so many historians are on the left. But of course, they approach history in a different way. They're much more approaching from the point of view of social science, and much less interested in the stories of history and in the remembered past, right? So in the Golden Thread book that Alan Gelso and I wrote together, we call it a history of the Western tradition, not a history of Western civilization. And what we're trying to emphasize is that it's a history of the remembered past. It's the history of the way people remembered the Greeks and the Romans and the Middle Ages and the Christian conquest of the Roman Empire and the medieval papacy and the empire and the rise of nation states and the rise of republics, that has a particular way that it's remembered. And it's a way that is very much involved with the development of practical wisdom, understanding decision-making. That's what history was really written for before the time of Hegel. History was there to inform decision-makers, whether they be citizens or statesmen, but mostly statesmen, that this is something that's happening to you now. We search the pages of history to see something similar. What were the outcomes then? What were the decisions made? And, what are the dangers of taking this course of action? And what have been the most successful courses of action? That's what history was for. And I think we've really impoverished ourselves by not using that as a approach to history anymore.
What is Western civilization? You've alluded to it several times, pointing to essentially this sort of sequence of milestones and moments, the Greeks, the Romans. But is there, how should someone that wants to, what is this Western tradition when you sort of try to synthesize the telling into a set of principles?
Well, first of all, Alan and I think of the Western tradition as a succession of civilizations. So the civilization of the Greeks was the first of the Western civilizations. It begins essentially in the 8th century BC, and Homer is the first great author. And that civilization was superseded by the Romans in the 2nd century AD, or BC. And then the Romans had their civilization, which absorbed that of the Greeks. That's an important point, that each successive civilization absorbs the previous one and admires the previous one. And then there was the Christianization of the Roman Empire in the 4th century AD. And we approach this Christian empire as a different civilization. It starts off being continuous with ancient Rome, and that gradually becomes more and more of a Christian civilization. And then we talk about the origins of modern European civilization, which I take back to the late 11th century. So it's a succession of civilizations, but it's bound together by this thread of tradition, gold thread of tradition, because there was always...
What is that 11th century? People. Just stop at that. What was the 11th century moment that constitutes the European civilization for you?
Well, this is not my invention. There are many historians who take the same view. In the 10th century, in Western Christendom, in the Latin-speaking part of Christendom, not Byzantium, but the Latin-speaking part, there was a general civilizational collapse in the 10th century. That Western Europe was invaded by Vikings, it was invaded by Arab, Muslim raiders from the south, it was attacked by the Magyars from the east, various barbarian tribes, and it just was collapsing. And they lost any kind of central order in the civilization. But that started to be rebuilt in the late 11th century through the papacy and through the revival of the medieval German Empire. So the High Middle Ages, which is the beginning of European civilization, is it's a new civilization in many ways, and I won't worry your listeners by listing them all, but it's a civilization that draws not only on the Greeks and the Romans, but also on the Germanic peoples, what the ancient Romans would have called the barbarians. So something like parliaments, for example, is really a Germanic contribution to Western civilization. The Germans were, I say Germans to mean pretty much all the successors, Charlemagne and his successors, right? These Germans had a different form of government. Charlemagne, for example, would never make a decision without consulting all the lords in his territories. He used to go around these progresses. So you can say that German monarchy is much more consultative than any previous monarchy. People had the right to be heard and to give counsel. So that eventually grew into the parliamentary system in England in the 13th century. But there are a number of things like this. The Germans also combined, and eventually the Normans most of all, combined the military prowess of the Vikings with the Romans. The Normans, who really dominate the High Middle Ages, are militarily a combination of Viking sea raiding skills and the traditional formation fighting on horseback that the Normans got from the French before them, so you have this very powerful military tradition that's quite different from the Roman tradition ultimately, which takes over Western Europe in the late 11th, 12th century. And that is what is launched against the Muslims in the Crusade, and so forth. So there's one of the ways you can divide up civilizations is by the type of military system that they have, and the Europeans invented a new one. So I mentioned parliaments, I mentioned military systems. There's also different social systems, which you can talk about. The patriarchal family is much more important for the Europeans. I know you're very interested in the family, so I was offering you some bait to ask me questions. But just get back to the main point, which you asked about, is a civilization is either, you can look at a civilization as a treasury of achievement, right? As great works of art, great political systems, inspiring philosophy, literature, the arts, you name it, as a set of resources in the past that can be learned about, reused, and can continue the tradition and can make new and original contributions to the tradition. So if you're an artist, you can measure yourself against previous artists. But it can also be thought of, and this is really what I think is important right now, is that a civilization is something that civilizes, right? So that if you want civilized generations to follow us, they have to study our civilization. If you study half a dozen different civilizations on an equal basis and have no particular admiration or knowledge of your own, that type of continuity is going to be very hard. So we call our story the golden thread because these civilizations have been tied together over 3,000 years by sometimes very tenuous threads. Can I give you an example of this?
We'll give the example, and then I want to ask about. I have a question I'll try to remember. But give me an example of this thread.
So, the basis of modern legal traditions is Roman civil law. It was revived in the 12th century, and it became the basis of legal education. So even today, in some universities, you can study Roman jurisprudence as examples of how legal problems are solved, how the Romans solved their problems, how they negotiated the statute, the actual case, the needs of the common good. There were brilliant examples of jurisprudential decisions taken, and they were reduced to a single book, which is called the Digest of Legal Opinions. It was created under the authority of the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. So in the 11th century, there is one manuscript of this in the entire world. So the basis of modern European jurisprudence is reduced to a single manuscript. And the works of Aristotle, right? Aristotle's works, his technical works, which is what we have today, his works on ethics and biology and politics and physics, and all those works were down to a single box of scrolls in the 1st century BC. We almost lost, and Aristotle, if you know anything about the history of Western education, he's the backbone of Western education from the 12th century to the 17th century. When the scientific revolution happens, it's revolting against Aristotle, but Aristotle's still being taught. I teach Aristotle's ethics and politics still today, and they're unsurpassed. But it was a single box of manuscripts. It just makes my sort of heart beat with fear when I read the story. So there are lots of cases like that, and we almost lost Latin literature in the 7th century AD when after the Muslim invasions. There are people.
Now, what exactly was that? Was it just because the Muslim conquerors were burning books? Like what was the nature of the potential losses?
Well, the Muslim conquest started in the 7th century. They took away 2/3 of the Roman Empire, the Middle East, Egypt, North Africa. They were taking over most of Spain until it was reconquered. And the West became the Reconquista, yeah. So the West became extremely poor. They could barely keep things going on an economic level. There was no culture the culture survived in monasteries. And there are a few people copying monasteries, but there are very few copies of any Western work of literature in the 7th century. So suddenly, in the 8th century, when Charlemagne is advised by Alcuin that he has to refound Latin literature, suddenly we have thousands of manuscripts. So somebody made a decision at some point, it was Charlemagne and his advisor, that we couldn't simply copy the Bible and a few of the church fathers. We had to recover Roman civilization because the Romans had known how to run a civilization. They had law, they had administrative systems, they had just basic grammar and knowledge of how to speak, which was disappearing at the time. This is the period when the Latin language was disappearing and the vernacular language was just getting started. So Charlemagne said, we have to bring back Roman literature, Roman philosophy, and that's when it came back. So that was, again, another moment when things almost died out.
Yeah, it's one of these things that when you think about what got us to where we are today, there's an inevitability that's sort of baked into the fact that we're here, that it feels like it could only have gone this way. And it's kind of terrifying, frankly, to like linger on what the other path would have been if Aristotle was lost, if the monasteries had been sacked and raided and nothing was left.
Were.
I mean,
many of them were.
I know there's some people who are critical, look back on sort of the history of Islam as a conquering force, since all of the Islamic world today was as I understand it, was actually the dominant force of Christendom at the time, the Byzantine Empire, and say that actually that Islamic expansion was responsible, at least in part, for the Dark Ages. It sounds like that's what you're talking about at that moment. Is that right? Is that how you understand what precipitates the Dark Ages?
Well, the Byzantine Empire preserved Greek literature and Greek civilization, which was always more advanced than Latin, and they preserved it against, the Muslims almost conquered Constantinople in 717. That would have been the end of Western civilization, at least humanly speaking. I think divine providence might have something to say about it, but that, humanly speaking, that would be what saved the Greek part of Western civilization. But yes, I mean, the Islamic invasions were a terrible blow to the West, and they impoverished the West. The Byzantines were kind of, what's the city? And they're the Minas Tirith of Christendom at the time. Osgiliath, which is Rome, had been destroyed, but Minas Tirith is still there in Constantinople, preserving the Western tradition. And then we have the men of the West who are keeping things alive in northwestern Europe. But yes, it was a terrible setback for Christian civilization. And but one shouldn't get the idea that the Muslims didn't have their own civilization. They did. Obviously, they built a great civilization. And they used some of the materials from ancient West, right? They used a lot of, they hated the Romans. The Romans were the bugbears of the Muslims, but they recognized that they learned warfare in part from the Romans, in part from the Persians. So they did create a civilization of their own, but it's not, for a long time, Muslim civilization was really the enemy of the West. And it's, to me, indicative that when the Islamic threat starts to recede seriously in the 17th century, right, that's when we have liberalism growing up, because the pressure was off. That's what I think, that freedom is something that you can enjoy when you have power and you have peace and you have wealth. But when you're under assault, you have to have a more authoritarian system. That's always the case, right? During World War II, the U.S. presidency became much more authoritarian necessarily. Yep. So when the pressure lifts up in the 17th century and Western Europe can breathe and can enjoy its wealth, enjoy its power, that's when you get liberalism, which is well, that's a historian's view of liberalism. It's not a political scientist's view. But that's the way I think about liberalism as a luxury good of civilized countries.
If you like this clip, you should check out the full video and all the other great content we've got at Dad Saves America. So be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and ring that bell so you won't miss our new stuff as it drops each week.